Hello and welcome to the Happy Farm D podcast. This is your host, as always, Alex Barker. And for this episode, we're going to be talking about business. Obviously, my favorite subject on our channel. We normally like to talk about careers, and that is the focus of a lot of our work. But the way I think we're going to get through this job crisis is by creating jobs. And the way to start is to learn from people who are in the trenches, creating startups, creating businesses that are hiring other pharmacists. And with me today, I have Rui Su, who is a pharmacist I connected with through one of my Canadian colleagues, Ashwin, and he connected me with Rui, and we found out about MedMe, which is a startup that is all about integrating pharmacy into other healthcare organizations. We'll talk more about this, but really where I want to talk about is Rui's career journey, about how she went from doing the typical things that a pharmacist does to joining something that a lot of people see as very, very risky. And I love it because I love taking risks. So Rui, thanks for hanging out with me.
Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, Alex. It's my pleasure to be here, and I hope that even though I bring a Canadian perspective, all of you will be able to get something out of my journey into entrepreneurship and how I kind of transition from the typical to the atypical.
So we'll talk a little bit about the differences between Canada and America, or the United States. I almost said America. Oh my gosh, how American of me. Whoops, that'll go in the podcast. So we'll talk a little bit about those differences between the States and Canada, but tell us a little bit about your career. Why'd you choose pharmacy, and what did the beginning of your career look like?
Yeah, Alex. So I graduated from the University of Waterloo. It's also where I did my undergraduate education. And I like to say that I was almost hoodwinked into the profession, as there was this conditional admission program from high school that was recruiting for, the best and the brightest kids to join the exclusive club of pharmacy. And so I applied thinking, this is it. This is the elite path forward, and I kind of just got into this program. And in my first 2 years of my undergrad, I was able to explore a lot of other dimensions because I felt like my future had a path forward. And that was kind of the seed to me being able to be where I am today, because I was able to explore tech and entrepreneurship and consulting and interact with so many different people with different interests and background. And that allowed me to have a more open mind when it came to coming into professional school, to see how I could integrate all those pieces together in my future work. And this really was because I went to school in Waterloo, and we call it the Silicon Valley of the North. And I essentially went to school with a number of entrepreneurs who are now running huge companies who have IPO'd. And being in that kind of incubator environment where everyone around you is talking about, tech and the next big thing, really affected me and allowed me to kind of open the door to an entire different world that I really didn't know much about before. And that world, coupled with, my pharmaceutical care education and memorizing top 100 drugs and all the other clinical pieces, was kind of the perfect complement to each other in me kind of figuring out what my niche was. So early on, I knew that this was an area of interest to me, but I didn't really understand until later on how important it is for someone in pharmacy to find kind of that niche or that area that they're really good at. I was watching some New York Fashion Week videos, and there was the founder of Alice and Olivia that said, be known for one thing. And I found this to be such a powerful statement, especially for pharmacists today, because there's obviously so much that we can do, so much that we're well equipped to do, but the true value to being able to be competitive in this job market is finding that one good thing that you love, that you're deeply interested in, that you're good at, and be known for that thing. And for me, that was health tech and digital health. And that led to a number of different opportunities, such as hackathons and pitch competitions that I became involved in, because when somebody thought, hey, I want to do something in pharmacy and technology or healthcare and technology, let's ring up Rui, or let's send this to Rui because she would be totally over this. And so that was my getting my feet wet by joining a number of these different competitions on a smaller basis. I got to work with a number of technologists and people from other disciplines in order to kind of start my gears running.
Now, were you a student when you did that or a pharmacist?
So I was a student when I became involved in a number of these different ventures. But even as a pharmacist, new career pharmacist, I found that being connected to the student ecosystem allowed me to still dabble my feet and be involved in a lot of these really cool and interesting things that were happening, and also opened up opportunities to mentor students as well. Because in the school capacity, there's just so much opportunity and time, I guess, for these different things that people are doing versus, in the workplace, it's a lot harder to get new initiatives running and a lot harder to find opportunities. So having a step in the school setting was helpful for me as well.
So take us from, your pharmacy education, which, by the way, I thought it was pretty funny. You said hoodwinked. I don't know if that's like title worthy for this episode, like tricked into pharmacy kind of thing, but that may be a little bit misleading. So you graduated University of Waterloo. Walk us through, from graduation to MedMe. What does that look like?
Yeah. So for me, graduation and stepping into the quote unquote real pharmacy world of practice was a bit jarring. My education really focused on the therapeutic and clinical services piece of pharmacy. And all of my rotations were heavily focused on how can we deliver consults and pharmaceutical care to our patients. I worked in a specialized geriatrics clinic. I worked in just a number of these environments where that was what I focused on. And then I come out, and given today's job market, it was community pharmacy and your big box chain pharmacy. And when I started practicing, I was really shocked at the way that we were evaluated. So coming into contact with quotas not just for prescriptions, but for clinical services, and also tracking. So software that tracked how much time you spent on every single task. I'm not sure if this has been in the works for a long time in the US, or it's something that's recently come up. But I felt like I was in a manufacturing plant, that I wasn't a pharmacist providing care to patients, that I was almost in a factory having quotas to produce prescriptions and clinical services. And that did not sit well with me. I didn't believe that that's what we were educated for 4 years for. That's not what the ethos of the pharmacy profession should be geared towards. But when I really reflected on this, I can't just demonize the big box chains. Fundamentally, this is a mismatch in incentives and reimbursement structure that has been present in the pharmacy industry for a very, very long time. And despite, the PharmD education providing this new way of looking at patient care, the real life practice of pharmacy does not allow for these practitioners to practice to what they believe in and what they're most passionate about. And so, as you can imagine, going into this was just, hey, why is there such a jarring difference between what I learned and what practice actually is? And can I see myself doing this for the next 20, 30, 40 years?
So it sounds like you had a little bit of a moral injury, right? You felt like ethically You were supposed to be doing something that provided care to patients, but what you were forced to do was take care of numbers rather than people. So as you're practicing, it sounds like all during this time, you're still quite involved with maybe your university, or you're involved with like some tech things. Is that going on the side, or is that happening at the job while you're working?
Yeah, so while I was in the middle of my quarter life crisis, I was trying to find all these other opportunities, these different ways where, I could still make money and use my pharmacy education, but do something different. So I went and I did work for a pharmacy education company that was helping prepare new grads or pharmacy students for their licensing exams. And I got in with them to create more continuing education materials. So that focus on education and creation of still pharmacy relevant information in a different setting. I also explored writing for a tech company in California. And this was not healthcare related at all, but I wanted to see, hey, what are the skills that I'm really good at, and how can I parallel that to a different setting? And so I was just exploring all these other avenues that I could get involved in, and also messaging, my network that I had built when I was in Waterloo to see, hey, what kind of opportunities are there out there for me? And this took a lot of self-reflection. So I kind of held these two things in mind when I was considering this process. One is, what am I good at? What are the skills that I learned in pharmacy that I can translate over to a different job, to a different role, or a different opportunity? Is it my ability to communicate, both in terms of writing and communicating and distilling complex information into simple digestible pieces for my patients? Is it my ability to do research, to look at clinical evidence and look at really complex pieces of material and find out the important pieces from that? Or is it just my ability to problem solve? As pharmacists, when we look at scripts, we solve clinical problems all the time. And even when we find ways to get patients their medication, that's also solving problems at the same time. So how can I translate all these skills that I learned through pharmacy to something else? And that was the first piece. And I was speaking to some pharmacy mentors, and they recommended me this book called Strength Finders in order to, figure out what are my strengths and how can I kind of parallel them to something else. And so that was really helpful for me to think about. And then second piece is, where do my personal values lie? So taking a really hard look at who I am, what do I want? When I imagine the kind of work that I want to do, how does that look like? Where is that work-life balance? Do I value washroom breaks and being able to eat my meals without scarfing it down in 10 minutes? Or do I value that direct patient interaction piece? Like, out of everything that I love about pharmacy, I kind of broke it down to find, what are the parts that I love and what are the parts that I would rather do without. So in addition to that, I also thought about, okay, so if this is the kind of work that I want, a flexible, very engaging, creative kind of way, like, is there anyone who's currently doing it right now? So I went down, the LinkedIn rabbit hole to find connections of connections of connections in Canada, but also in the United States, to see, hey, is there anyone doing what I want to do? And, just cold message them. And honestly, the pharmacy network has been so incredible, especially on LinkedIn, to be able to connect to people and just hear their story and hear their journey. And I'm so glad that you're doing this podcast, because it just allows for that dissemination of information for people who want to kind of step outside of what has already been done. So really glad that I'm on here as well, Alex. So that piece is really important, to be able to find others who have done it before me. And unfortunately for me, a lot of what I wanted to do, I didn't really see it in mentors. I didn't really see it out there. And
what was that work that you were looking for?
I wanted to be a pharmacist working in a health tech company in Canada. And so I was looking within Ontario, within my geographic region, looking for a role where I could, not just develop order sets, which was one of my old co-op companies, that's what they did, but also be engaged in working with a multidisciplinary team of product designers, of software engineers, and also be almost in the small and scrappy early stages of creating some sort of product that people could use. Yeah. And I've reached out to a number of health tech companies here, and none of them had an opening for a pharmacist, which was very devastating to me, because I was like, hey, I did all this work. I'm really passionate about this, but they were like, hey, sorry, like we're just not hiring for a pharmacist right now. It's not really in our roadmap. So that didn't pan out too well. And so I had to find a way to think about what would it take for me to create this job of my dreams, and what steps, what skills, first of all, should I attain to be able to be the first one they call when that job opens up? Or how can I position myself so that when future opportunities came up, I would be the most skilled person for that job? And so it was me kind of doing this internal exploration when I kind of got this call from my friend, not so much of a call as a Facebook message these days. Okay. And it was a friend of mine from Waterloo who is an entrepreneur herself. She makes women's clothing with pockets. And I love her. I love her dearly.
Yeah, that's needed. Yeah.
And so she and I were really good friends in Waterloo, and she said, hey, I'm working at this incubator right now where we have a number of entrepreneurs that come in for this annual program. It's called the Next 36 program here in Canada. And there's this guy who's working on a pharmacy software platform, and he's looking to connect with pharmacists. And I was like, hey, like I'm glad to help you if you want some feedback or whatnot. I'm glad to help a friend and move forward the profession. So I got a meeting with this guy who turned out to be the CEO and co-founder of MedMe. His name is Purya. And we just hit it off right away. We had a very in-depth conversation about all the problems in pharmacy right now. And in terms of just values and where we came from, he was an entrepreneur that was just trying to make a big buck, trying to make a big exit. He really cared about the problem. He really cared that, pharmacists had all this innate knowledge from their education that they could really provide the public, but incentive structures in software wasn't allowing them to do that. And after that connection, I just kind of the stars kind of lined up, and I started getting involved in MedMe more from a part-time basis, working with the team through a number of different iterations, and then joined full-time, kind of took the plunge, dropped everything else, and joined the team full-time in January of this year.
So you just joined MedMe January of 2020. That was a big leap, I'm sure, because you had a stable job where you had a paycheck coming every week. And granted, I'm sure that you were offered that at a startup. But I think when people think of startups, the first thing that I know pharmacists talk about with me when an opportunity like that is presented is, how stable is this? And am I willing to put up with an unstructured environment? Because if there's one thing pharmacists love, it's guidelines. They love rules and protocols. It sounds like you definitely are not built that way to, have so many rules. So what's going through your mind as you're evaluating this, opportunity to be a part of a startup versus staying with your, the job that you had at the time?
Yeah, it's interesting because even though I don't fulfill the archetype of the extremely detail oriented, very needing structured personality of a pharmacist, I inherently crave stability, and I don't do too well with uncertainty, which both things come hand in hand with a startup. So
Yeah.
I've definitely had my challenges in dealing with those. But first, I want to say that I acknowledge that I come from a very privileged position to even entertain the idea of not having a stable paycheck. I know, there's other people out there who may not have that ability to kind of just drop a stable paycheck and go into something that can fail and flounder and fail at any time. And so recognizing that and recognizing my support system, but with both my partner, my friends who are also in the startup industry, where I could literally call them up and say, hey, we have this problem. What do you think? Because you've done this before. That was already inherently such a blessing for me to have going into something as uncertain as this. I think that when considering dropping a very stable position, you have to first have an understanding of the scope of your role and what you'll be needed for and what you'll be doing. Because most of the time, depending on the startup, as the pharmacist, you may not be needed as a full-time employee right away. And because of the nature of our jobs, we can always take part-time release shifts and whatnot elsewhere that can still help sustain our income. That might be a good place to get started. And I also say this because when you join a startup, it's a very tight-knit, crazy journey. And you want to make sure that the people you're quote unquote getting into bed with are people that you will be happy to spend a lot of time working with, that you have similar working styles, that your values are similar. So there needs to be a testing period. And I recommend this to anyone who's joining a startup. There needs to be a period set out in the contract where you kind of feel each other out, see what working in that startup is like. You might love it, you might hate it, you might hate the people, you might hate where the company is going, or you might love it, or you might be lukewarm about it and be like, hey, I like my old job better. This is not for me. So there needs to be that testing period for you to dip in your feet and see if you're willing to kind of swim the entire length of the ocean for this company.
How long was your testing period?
So it was from August to December. So a good amount of time where I was able to go through some milestones, see where everybody's head was at, see what other opportunities were coming up, and also see if, this is something I really wanted to do. And there's a lot of bells and whistles when it comes to working at a startup, the flexibility, the coolness factor.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the coolness factor.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I think it's cool. I'm fascinated by it. I wish I was a part of it. I mean, I guess I am, but not in your sense. So let's talk a little bit about MedMe, because I think there's some differences to cover for Canada versus US. So for those that aren't aware, the Canadian system has a totally different healthcare system from what we have. Could you talk a little bit about what MedMe does, what its service is, and how it's solving a problem within your system?
For sure. So maybe we should need to start off with the differences in the healthcare systems first. So as you guys know, of course, Canada has a single payer system for hospital-related expenses. So if a patient goes into hospital for any inpatient or outpatient procedure, assessment, etc., that's all paid for by the government. Our visits with family doctors and specialists, anything physician related is remunerated by the government under a payment schedule. Now, medications are different because they are covered by the government if it's any inpatient medications, but any outpatient medications have to either be paid out of pocket or by the insurance provider. And so similarly to the States, if you typically have a benefits package with your employer and there's the paramedical expenses that are covered, dentists, optometrists, physiotherapists, etc. And then there's the medications piece. And in addition to that, the government also pays for the medications of seniors, so anyone over 65, and more recently, young individuals as well, who are, I believe, under the age of 25 as well. So, in addition to other social services and people on disability and etc.
I'm just curious, is that insurance for medications, is that a legal requirement or is it optional?
It is optional for employers, correct? Is what you're asking?
So that kind of insurance for prescriptions is provided through employers?
So if I understand your question correctly, it's not a legal requirement for every citizen to have insurance coverage for prescriptions.
Okay.
So it's not a legal requirement. So
Gotcha.
if you're a freelancer, a gig worker, etc., and you don't have insurance from your employer, you're not mandated to purchase insurance or prescription insurance to cover your medications out of pocket.
Okay, so I think that's a good juxtaposition between our two countries. So what is MedMe solving in that sphere?
Yeah, so MedMe at its core is a virtual care platform for pharmacists to deliver clinical services at scale. And what that means is digital health and virtual medicine kind of making waves right now, and us kind of understanding that access to patients are not equal, and also understanding that not all the work of a pharmacist has to be done within the scope of the physical environment of the pharmacy. That's the virtual piece. But the clinical care piece is that current billing software are designed for billing. The current software that's used in most pharmacies is fundamentally designed to help dispense medications. It's not optimized to provide documentation, to provide tracking of interventions, to have automated follow-up mechanisms that take in patient information and have that information ready for academia and researchers and policymakers to look at to see, hey, if the pharmacist identified this drug therapy problem and provided this intervention, like how are we supposed to know how it improves their outcomes? And how is that also linked to hospitalization records and all of that? All of that is so distinct from each other right now. And there's no platform for the pharmacist to be able to, in a structured way, provide care. And number of these that we know in terms of medication review, like MTM in the States, which we don't really have here in Canada. We just have a 30-minute appointment for the pharmacist to kind of review their medications. And here in Ontario, it's paid at $60 a pop with a ton of documentation, kind of somewhat similarly in other provinces, but there's not enough reimbursement as well for these kind of services.
So basically what you're doing is connecting everything together, right? And providing an easy access platform for pharmacists to utilize within Canada to not only provide the service, but also just to have the information necessary to do that.
Exactly. And one of the challenges that we have is pharmacists actually getting paid for clinical services. I'm sure that this is a challenge.
Yeah. It's universal.
It's a universal challenge that we experience. And if we don't give pharmacists the tools that enable them to do this on a scalable way that won't sap too much of their time in terms of documentation, scheduling, and all of those things, then what are we looking at? Because if we don't show the government, to insurers, whoever the payer is in that situation, the value of our interventions, then how will we ever be able to advocate for that to be reimbursed for. And we will just continue to go down this path where we're just becoming a manufacturing dispensing machine. And we look at, the trends that are in America and in Canada as well, with, central fill dispensaries, with mail order pharmacies, Amazon is with its large supply chains. Where does that leave us as pharmacists if so much of that dispensing piece is replaceable? If we look towards the future of our profession, where can we bring value? And fundamentally at MedMe, we think that it's in the clinical services, and that's why we're creating a software platform that, number one, advocates through data for pharmacists to provide more and be reimbursed for these clinical services, but two, create a new model where pharmacists can actually do this, not just centrally at the pharmacy, but anywhere that they wish as well.
Awesome. I love it. And I think it's the wave of the future. If I had a knack for technology, I wish I did, because that's the area that I would want to get into. I think what's holding us back from really adopting provider status in part is the support systems, right? So we need the platforms necessary in order to deliver the services. Otherwise, we can deliver them all we want, but if it takes too much time to bill, if it takes too much time for the admin work, then we can't get it done. So I think this is really, really smart. For the pharmacist that's heard your story, what would be some of the really quick maybe recommendations you'd make to see how they could get their feet wet in the world of startups? My obvious recommendations are, there's so many podcasts, there's so many resources, there's so many networking events that you could attend, but maybe there's a specific resource or something that you would recommend.
You're right, Alex. There's so many resources that are out there, but I think one of the biggest challenges that pharmacists face is fear of the unknown. Mm-hmm. And I almost think it's an intrinsic barrier that prevents us from exploring and looking outwards and connecting with others who are also doing similar things, who want to do similar things, or doing things in other horizontals that can be applicable to ourselves. And I think that from my personal experience, there was always this inner voice that's saying, you're not good enough. What do you know about tech? You're just a pharmacist. That's what you went to school for. What value can you actually bring? And I think that it's in battling this internal voice and having the courage to actually say to yourself, I can do this. I have the skills necessary to do this, and I can find the opportunities to do this. It's this internal work, I think, that we all can work on. And I am definitely working on it on a day-to-day basis, because this imposter syndrome of being an entrepreneur and a quote-unquote chief clinical officer at a startup is what gives me that value. And I think you have to give yourself that value. And by allowing yourself to, number one, reach out to those people on LinkedIn, reach out to coaches like yourself, or reaching out to individuals when you're at a networking session, because we can always go to a networking session, but making something out of that is on yourself. So being open to talking with whoever is there that brings you out of your comfort zone, I think that's where the magic lies, or that's where the key can open the door, is bridging that internal sense of what are we doing here, and changing that into I belong here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I usually say that opportunity lies just outside of your comfort zone. But until you move, you took a lot of risks to get to where you are. And, the beauty that a lot of the startup world that a lot of people don't think about is you're forced to network. You're forced to be so well connected with other people that, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if MedMe does fail, you likely have plenty of opportunities just right outside of your comfort zone, where you could step into those roles and do some new things and learn new skills because you're forced to know so many people and what's going on in your network. I mean, if there's one world that I've thought of that is perhaps one of the most safest for job security, it is in your world. But I think it's painted not that way at all because everyone's got this fear of failure. I mean, that's a part of the game in business that you have to come face to face with. But I want to go back to reflect on your education. Do you think that your journey to become a pharmacist that negatively impacted you to make this career decision? Do you feel like, your training to, avoid risk slowed down this process? Or do you feel like you did that internal work before the startup and that led you to easily accept this role? Or do you think that played at all? I'm kind of spitballing this question, but I'm trying to dig at the idea that, as pharmacists, we're trained to avoid risk. If that's beaten into you over 4 years of an education, it's very hard to consider something like what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that it's always been this dichotomy of forces inside me. So in my personal time, I love to travel. I love to backpack and experience new cultures and just open up that area of risk. But then I also crave stability and I crave consistency. And it's always been this kind of an angel and demon kind of just like fighting internally inside of me. And I think it's another layer and a parallel where in pharmacy you have that consistent detail-oriented structure that's kind of beaten into you for you to be a good pharmacist. And I think that is inherently very important. But this other piece of being able to see outside of just the historical roles that you're able to sit in, and also be able to see where all these skills, which you may see from the outset as purely clinical, how all of those skills and the processes to conduct all these pharmacy related services do actually translate so well to so many other domains. I think that for me, I don't regret going through these 4 years because I think that they've given me so much in terms of a structured way of looking at the world, in addition to seeing all these patients and seeing this overarching healthcare system and being able to identify all the different viewpoints. And I think that's the most precious gift that pharmacy has given me, is to be able to look at the world, to look at healthcare from multiple perspectives, and continue to look at the world from multiple perspectives in the perspective of a software developer or a designer. And if we keep leaning into this, we'll find that discomfort isn't actually what's holding us back, because what we're trained to do is not so different from this new world of discomfort that that we hope to operate in, because we have all the tools that we need to be able to, quote unquote, take the risk and do these different things, because it's all fundamental building structures. Like they're building blocks that you already have that foundation. And it's just that, hey, you have the training to look at a blueprint. You have the training to lay down the foundation bricks. But now they're just asking you to build a chalet instead of an Ontario cottage. You can still do that because you have the skills to architect and imagine that. It's just making yourself believe that, like, I can build a chalet. I'm not just bound to an Ontario cottage. I can build a chalet just as well as I can build maybe even a bridge.
I love it. Thank you so much, Rui, for sharing your story. I think you're set. The way I look at your career, you're doing exactly what I wish every pharmacist was doing to find the opportunities that are out there, because there are plenty of these opportunities, maybe in even areas that you'd never stumble upon naturally, but your curiosity led you exactly to where you are, and through a powerful network, you found an amazing opportunity. So congratulations on, just your accomplishments, and keep hustling, keep at it. and excited to see MedMe come to the States.
Thanks so much, Alex. I think that just to leave off, I think some of the qualities that have led me to where I am is just being open, being inquisitive, and just being critical as well of whatever you're doing. Because I think the mistake that most hurt us is just taking things for as they are, as they're presented to us. And so if we keep these characteristics with us, I think that any pharmacist out there will be able to create the job and the life that they deserve and dream of. So thank you for having me on here, and best of luck to everyone, and hope that everyone stays safe during these challenging times right now and up ahead.
Thank you, Ria. I appreciate it.